Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on combining dynamic authorization and federated identity for secure, comprehensive, and adaptive access control. My name is Kim Locke. I'm with Radiant Logic, and I'll be your moderator for today's program. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that your lines will be muted for the duration of the webinar. However, if you have a question, you may enter it in the question portal, and we will have a Q&A session at the end if time allows. If we are not able to get to your question during the webcast, we'll send a personal email to follow up. Also, this webcast will be recorded and sent out along with a copy of the presentation slides within the next 24 hours. Our speakers today are Jerry Gable, Vice President of Business Development at Axiomatics. In his role, Jerry supports Axiomatics' sales team, support staff, and partners to meet customer requirements for dynamic authorization. Previously, he served as VP and Service Director for Burton Group's identity management practice. He is an expert in authorization, federation, identity, and access governance, user provisioning, and other IAM topics. And Wade Ellery, Senior Solutions Architect at Radiant Logic. Wade has extensive experience in enterprise IT direct and channel software and services sales and management. He has in-depth knowledge and experience in enterprise IAM, IGA, risk and compliance, and IT security challenges. We'll start with you, Jerry.
Hi, Kim. Thanks very much. And thanks, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. It's great to be back with Radiant Logic and particularly with Wade to do a webinar again, of course, featuring dynamic authorization and federated identity. So from the Axiomatics perspective, of course, we are all about the dynamic authorization side of that coin. And that means it's determining at runtime whether or not you have access to sensitive resources. And that's really the key for us, is protecting that sensitive, regulated intellectual property or other kinds of digital assets in the digital enterprise of today. And there could be lots of different reasons for needing to protect that information. Like I said, it could be for compliance or regulatory reasons, but it just also may be part of your information security posture for privacy reasons and so on. And this kind of dynamic authorization model is applicable for many different kinds of resources or digital assets. It could be your business applications, API-based applications, microservice architected applications, as well as databases and big data resources. And to dig a little bit further, when we talk about dynamic authorization, we often refer to the term ABAC, or attribute-based access control. Now, this is a runtime access control model, right? It's not at provisioning time, for example, or administrative time, but it's during the runtime process when you're attempting to access some protected resource. The policies have defined the rules for who can access or update or modify those digital resources. And attributes are the input to that evaluation equation. And attributes can represent almost anything about not only the user, but also the resources or records that you're attempting to access. And just as a brief further overview, what this looks like at runtime within, for example, the Axiomatics policy server, is that you have some type of user who's attempting an action within an application. So within that flow, either within the application or, for example, with an API gateway, that flow is intercepted. And we construct a message and send that to an authorization engine or a service within the infrastructure. This is where those policies that I mentioned have been defined, and they're running in memory, processing these incoming requests. And in addition to that, the authorization engine can look up other attributes, for example, about Alice. What department is she in? What is her clearance level? But we can also look up information about the record. What department is record 1, 2, 3 associated with? What is its classification level? And we'll talk more about where these attributes come from, of course, when Wade comes into the webinar here. So now with all of this information, we can make a decision. Permit, yes, she can view this record, or deny, no, she does not have access to this record. That information is passed back to the enforcement point, and that decision is enforced or carried out. If it's permit, then the flow continues, the record is processed and sent back. If it's to deny, then the user gets some kind of error message that they don't have access to that particular record. So if you don't have this kind of service available in your infrastructure, well, then you might be seeing some of these kinds of symptoms. And we'll go into a couple of these in a little more detail in the following slides. But for example, if you don't have the capability to dynamically determine access, well, you could be potentially over or under provisioning users. What do we mean? Well, if you're over provisioning, maybe you're giving them more access than they really need, but you don't have a way to fine tune that. And so now you're possibly taking on more risk than you're comfortable with. If you're under provisioning, that means you're not giving them quite enough information to do their job, and you're losing productivity or effectiveness. With policy constructs scattered through source code, that's a difficult situation because it's hard to audit and evaluate who has access to what. In a lot of legacy environments, we talk to customers who say they have literally millions of static entitlements to manage, because these things have built up over the years with different application teams building their own entitlement model, or bringing in commercial apps that have their own entitlement model. For new development, we've seen a big transition over the last few years to a DevOps or DevSecOps model, where we want to do continuous innovation, continuous application development and implementation. Well, how does your security model fit into that kind of continuous delivery approach? Many organizations, of course, want to be able to share more applications functions as well as more data with more users, whether that could be within your organization across some of the department boundaries, but also to the external users. How can you do that effectively and properly without a robust authorization capability? Similarly, as we're moving to the cloud, both for applications and for data, we also see the trend where organizations want to deploy to multiple cloud providers, whether for different functionality capabilities across those cloud environments, or just because they want to spread the risk. Their organizations are looking for a consistent way to do access control or authorization across those environments, so they don't have to rely on the individual tools of each cloud platform. And then on the data side, so many organizations are moving from the historic data silos that they managed previously to these data lakes, where lots of different kinds of data are being commingled, and we need a much more robust authorization model to make sure we're allowing the right access to those data elements. So a couple of deeper dives here, just on the fragmented policy perspective. This is what it might look like from the developer's point of view, that if they don't have an external service, an infrastructure service that they can call to make these authorization decisions, well, then that logic, that code has to reside somewhere. And oftentimes we find that it's within the applications. Even on the new development side, this now could be incorporated within your APIs and bloating your APIs with this excess logic that could just be outsourced to an authorization service. Similarly, on the entitlement side, you've lost control of your role-based systems when you see things like this, where one customer told us that they had 7,000 customers, but you can see here almost 100,000 different kinds of roles to determine access for the different combinations of access that they needed to support. And another organization said that, well, they have some automated provisioning of role assignment, but then they still hired 50 people just to continually search through those role assignments for any kind of separation of duty conflict. So obviously that's not scalable and also pretty expensive. So what are one of the reasons why we can deal with millions of entitlements and these fragmented policies? Well, it's the policy language within the attribute-based access control model. Attributes get the headline because ABAC is about attributes, but the policies really reflect the business requirements and the business scenario, and it enables you to make things simpler to implement and manage going forward, because we can combine these different attributes from different sources to determine whether access is granted or denied, and really gives the business side of the house more control, because we can express the policies in plain old English language from a business perspective, not from a technical or technology perspective. So we can take statements like doctors can view medical records of any patient in their department and update any patient record that is directly assigned to them. So for example, in this case, it doesn't matter how many departments the hospital has. They can create new ones, they can merge departments, but you don't have to, you don't have to change the policy when you change departments. The assignment of the user, or the doctor in this case, to a different department will change their access whenever they log into the system. So if we take an example use case, speaking of the doctor example, we'll have different kinds of attributes or information that will make up this use case. We have doctors, we have the patients or members, we could have insurance agents involved in the scenario. On the resource side, we have different kinds of medical records or insurance records. And then some of the other attributes could be location or device type or time of day or the care relationship. And that happens not only on the caregivers, but even on the, on the member side of things. There could be relationships involved. So the way we step through this is that when we gather up the information, we are looking to collect those English language statements of who has access to what. And here you can see several examples for the members, for doctors, for insurance agents. And then from this kind of information, we can start to break things down and identify where the needed attributes come from. So if we take one of these statements, a member can view their own medical records. Great. What does this mean? Well, if we start highlighting the different attributes, we know that member is one of them. So this is a role, and we know that it comes from an LDAP system, and we know what category that it belongs to. Next up, the action. We want to view a record. Great. This is coming from the application itself. And then the medical records, of course, in this example, is the resource. So this is also part of the application, and its category is the resource. What's also interesting here is how do we account for the relationship? This is something that's not really easy or possible to do with a role-based model, but when you have the policy language to represent the logic, well, now we can compare the subject ID of the user, or the member in this case, with the owner field of the medical record. So we know if that matches, and then this statement turns out to be true, and we can permit access. So that's just a quick review or description of how we identify the requirements for access, and then how we can break down those statements and look to see what attributes we need to write the policies with, and then we can determine where those attributes come from. Because again, at runtime, we have users coming in to the environment, trying to access information, resources, conduct transactions, and so on. And the runtime engine may need to retrieve additional attributes, because maybe we only have the subject ID and we only have the record of or the resource that they're trying to access. We could have, say, a JSON web token that has additional user information in it. But there's many cases where that is not sufficient to evaluate the policies. So that's where the system can be configured to connect to different kinds of attribute sources, whether that's in an LDAP directory, a database of some type, or a JSON service or a web service. You know, all of the system can call any of those kinds of data sources and retrieve information. However, when that info is scattered across several different environments, then it can really be simplified by using the Radiant Logic Federated Identity model to correlate, aggregate, and bring all of that data together in a single feed to the Axiomatics system. And Wade, this is where I'm going to hand over to you to talk more about how you handle data from these different sources, bring it all together for us as a consumer, as you do for many other kinds of applications. And then I'll be back a little bit later on and we can address some questions from the audience. So Wade, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Jerry. I really appreciate all the information you shared with us. And I do want to reiterate that this is a hand-in-glove partnership between Radiant Logic and Axiomatics. This is one of the most complementary scenarios that we work with. And we'll go through in some more detail here. You'll start to see almost immediately how Radiant Logic provides the information, the fuel, the food that Axiomatics consumes to give the policy enforcement and the delivery for the applications, and that level of really important and high security around the high value operations. And as Jerry mentioned earlier, that's one of the focuses, is that you really need to, it's almost like a privileged access management focus, in that you want to put the most guards around the room with the most gold in it. And this applies to the world of attribute-based access control inside applications. There's a lot of applications where simply authenticating and getting in the front door, you can go and browse around anything you want. It's just information. But when you're talking about really complex systems, proprietary information, financials, you really need to make sure that you've got granular controls inside those applications to layer in the level of security. And especially as we start talking about things like zero trust, continuous authorization, this is exactly what Axiomatics is providing, is that capability of delivering a unified view and control of your access in a way that business line managers can actually interact with it. And that, again, I think is a key piece we'll touch on a little bit more. So I want to kind of set the stage of why Radiant Logic has an important contribution in this scenario. And this goes back to a pretty common situation that's been built up in most organizations over the past years, decades, depending on how long you've been doing identity management and IT. But applications themselves and identity stores tend to be siloed. They tend to be built from the perspective of, I'm the only application in the world. I just get what I need and I do what I want, and I don't know about anybody else and I don't care. And there's some movement towards some unification of identity information. But now as we go to the cloud, we're doing the same thing all over again. We're distributing identity data in each of these cloud silos. I may have data inside my Salesforce application sitting up on Salesforce's servers that would be really valuable for policy enforcement, for access control to my pricing system. But that information is on an island in Salesforce. It's not necessarily available in that scenario. So what Radiant Logic does is it lets you let go of this kludgy point-to-point, connect each system individually to the sources of identity, and give you the capability of actually unifying your identity store, of unifying your set of identity information, so that you can reap the benefits of attribute-based access control. Because the key function here is you want to have as rich a set of identity information as possible. You want to have as much granularity as possible, because the finer grained your attributes are, the more granular your policies can be, the more effective your policies can be, the more you can model a business process that's described to you in a conference room, if you have all the attributes that the business manager expresses in his description of how something works, then you have the ability to wrap that in Axiomatics and make that an enforceable policy. If you don't have access to that information, then you're kind of stuck, because if you can't understand the environment you're working in, you can't build policies to manage it. So the promise of ABAC here is that fine-grained authorization and then a highly flexible model, again, being able to be driven by business level decisions and discussions. And this, in the identity management space, is one of our hardest bridges to get over with customers, especially early in the design and development process, is sitting down with a greenfield customer and saying, okay, well, describe how people get access to system A. And they look at you with deer in the headlights eyes and say, I don't know. We give them everything Betty has, and because Betty does that job and it all seems to work. There isn't always necessarily an understanding on the IT level, on the functional level, but they can describe what Betty's job is, what Betty needs access to. Oh, Betty needs to be able to view all these records in these systems. Does she update those records? No, she just runs reports against them. Okay, I can start to build a policy now based on the descriptions of Betty's job, even though the business person has no idea today how that happens under the covers. And these are solutions that contain capabilities to evaluate those attributes in environmental conditions and enforce those rules. So you can go even beyond attributes about Betty, but the time of the day, the system she's sitting on, the quarter that you're operating in, whatever might be the scenario that you want to add on additional filters into that system. But what it requires is, again, an infrastructure that's geared to support attributes. And this is that geared to support is, or geared towards, is a loaded term in the sense that you can't just have a big flat file of attributes that's static and gets updated once a month. That's not going to give you the real-time authorization that you need. That's not going to give you the somebody joined the organization 2 days after the flat file was published and we have to wait 28 days before they get anything. That's not going to give you the speed that you need to provide that information on. So the geared towards is delivering the information that is relevant, that is accurate to the sources in near real time and at the speed of a directory in a format that can be consumed easily by Axiomatics. It can easily be molded and adapted into an attribute-based access control policy. And the policy engine has to support ABAC. So, sorry, someone keeps insisting on spamming my phone. Central attribute server also is required. You need to have one place to go to get all this information. You don't want to have your attribute-based access control system trying to call multiple different backends simultaneously and then aggregate that information together. That's not an action you want to do in real time. And this is where Radiant Logic comes into play. We can manage those attributes centrally. We can load very large volumes of data, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of objects, and all the attributes associated with those objects to build a connected relationship between those particular systems. And in building that unified profile, we can understand that the same user exists in different platforms, potentially with different identifiers, but it's the same human being. So we want to be able to correlate that information together and deliver a unified view of that person. But we also don't want to inadvertently put together profiles that don't belong to the same person. So there's a lot of logic built into making those decisions. And then we source that identity profiles and the context used by the policy decision point. Now, context is important, as you saw earlier, it's not just that the doctor can view the patient's records, he can view the patient's records of records that he owns. So we have to have a source that says, what is the identifier on the record? What is the identifier on the doctor? Do these match? Yes, they do. Then he owns this one, and I can deliver that back as part of the decision process. So it's a relationship, context, and attribute partnership that works together to give you the information you need. And what's wonderful about Radiant Logic, you can do all this with a mouse. You can build this with our tools without having to code. The challenge in most large identity management deployments is that the projects get bogged down trying to write code for anomalies or normalization or correlation, or just trying to get the data into a usable format. You spend most of your budget and your consulting professional services hours cleaning up the mess that is inherent in all large organizations. It's nobody's fault. It's a mess. It's like my garage. I swear I try to keep my garage clean. It's an absolute disaster because things just get thrown in there that I promise to take care of later. That's what's happened with our identity infrastructures. And in that scenario, if you don't have a tool like Radiant Logic that's optimized to clean that information, to do that with built-in wizards and tools and mouse-driven operations and context building tools that make it very easy to do, then you're going to be writing lots and lots of code. But the problem with that code is that's custom. That works in that one scenario, that one time, and don't change anything because I got to come back in and rewrite it. So you want to have Radiant Logic in there to clean up that information, to prepare it, to get it ready for Axiomatics, and then be able to enhance the definition of the authorization policies. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but one of the key functions here is that you have the ability to normalize data down so that when you're writing a policy, you're saying everybody that's in New York, and I'm identifying New York as their state is capital N, capital Y, is authorized to see this information. Now, in the multitude of back-end systems, I may have New York spelled out. I may have it capital N period, capital Y period. I may have it capital N, little y. I may have lots of variations. If you try and feed all those variations into that policy, you'll only get a small portion of the affected group because you're looking for just capital N, capital Y. If you write the policy with all the variations, now you've gotten much more data to churn through in that policy evaluation. It's much easier to clean that data first with Radiant Logic. Normalize everything to capital N, capital Y. Don't ask the data owners to change their data. They're not going to. They won't be able to get around to it. It's like my garage. I promise I will someday. But now with Radiant, I can make those changes without affecting the backends at all. So what I have here in the model that Jerry pointed out or walked through in a couple different scenarios is I have a workflow basically that takes place in an ABAC authorization. I have a user coming in to request access to an application or to a resource. And the policy enforcement point is going to stop the user and say, let me check your attributes against the policy for accessing this resource and see if you are entitled to be able to access that resource. So in that scenario, we're going to go back to the policy decision point. It's going to evaluate the policy. It's going to pull the attributes from the policy information point, lots of P's here, and fill that information in. As you remember Jerry's illustration, you had the sentence there of who and what and when and how, and each of those was populated with an attribute, a particular doctor, accessing a view of a particular record. So that information flows in from the policy information point. But if the policy information point is simply a single Active Directory, and as I mentioned before, I've got valuable information sitting up in my Salesforce cloud application because I built a whole bunch of regional roles and ownership and all sorts of other functions inside my Salesforce that I need to include. I don't have that information available, so my policy cannot be that granular. But if you go to Radiant Logic and you actually take our platform and use that to incorporate now the information from all these different sources into a view that the Axiomatics platform sees as a single LDAP record for this user, with my AD information, with my LDAP information, with my security information from my security database, with additional HR data coming from the HR system, with all the other information that I need, all that information is available to me. And even the information sitting up in the cloud coming off Salesforce appears to be just another extended attribute in that user's LDAP record. So Radiant Logic allows you now to enhance this information. So now your policies get tremendously richer. And the granularity that you can enforce on access gets far deeper. So now you've got much closer to the concept of a zero trust. A zero trust model is basically just saying, coming in the door, I'm not going to give you access to everything. I'm going to evaluate your request, and based on all the things I know about you, all of your attributes, I'm going to grant that request. Well, that can be a tremendous amount of coding to try and build that model, unless you've got something like Axiomatics here, which can let you simply build a policy that says, I'm going to granularly enforce access to meet my zero trust requirements at each step in the process. And I'm going to evaluate that gate, that filter, that policy in real time with data from Radiant Logic and deliver a response back in a method and a model that for the user appears seamless. That is the delivery of zero-based trust and granular access or attribute-based access control. So that's critical to the process here. Now, there's three things that Radiant Logic is doing here. We're representing a model of existing objects, attributes, and relationships. As I mentioned earlier, relationships are very important also. It's not just the users and the attributes, but it is, what do you own? What are you a member of? What do you manage? Who reports to you? Who do you report to? All those functions which exist in these systems need to be retained. You need to keep the context of the user from these systems that you're sourcing all the information from. You can't just make a flat list of information. If you take out the relationships, then things like I can manage people who report to me directly becomes much more difficult. But if you retain that relationship in Radiant Logic, then it's a real simple model to say, here's everyone that reports to me, so I have access to all of their resources, or I can manage their profiles, or I can grant them access to requests for more application access, whatever you want to do in terms of a policy if you have that relationship information there. And what we do is we correlate this together. We build a global profile. We let you bring all this information into a single point that's available at Axiomatics, and it's available to Axiomatics in exactly the way Axiomatics wants to see it. City is called city, not L, because that's the way the policy is written. So we can make everything that shows up in L from AD populate the city field. First name is first name, last name is last name instead of SN and given name. All these things can be normalized into a much more user-friendly English type of model for that data, and even more complex things can be handled there. And then we're going to put this global list together. Everyone's going to exist in the list once. Even if they have multiple accounts in the system, we'll join them together. So when you're doing a search to say, I need to check on Wade Ellery's attributes to verify a policy that he's making a request against, if you search the system and you find 2 Wade Ellerys, like any single sign-on or authorization system, the process breaks down. So we make sure that everybody exists once, but all their data is unified, so you have a complete profile of those users. And then again, context is critical. You need to be able to hold relationships. You need to be able to understand everyone that reports to me is an attribute of my profile. Every group I'm a member of is an attribute of my profile. It's information that Axiomatics can query right from my profile to fill in that policy decision process and decide properly whether the user should be able to get access. So this set of slides here, this animation sort of illustrates for you how this all works. You have multiple sources of identity information here, and I've color-coded some functions here. If you look under title, I've got title a number of different ways: sales VP, VP of sales. I've got region in different manners. I've got department is indicated differently in different systems, and that's completely normal because these platforms were built independently. They populated the data with the format they were looking for, that they decided on when they were sitting whiteboarding their design, and they built their solution. But now you're trying to unify that data together. This is also really important if you're a company that goes through mergers and acquisitions and you put in an attribute-based policy solution like Axiomatics into your system to protect your most valuable assets. And now you bring in another organization and all of their information, their formatting, their their labeling, their structure is completely alien to your environment. It can take years to integrate that information in manually, to provision all those users, to transform that information, to write scripts, to flip things around. Literally with Radiant Logic, we can integrate a new organization into your identity store in weeks. And we can do all the transformation and remapping for you at the Radiant level so that we don't break the acquired company, and we give you the immediate ability to include them in your attribute-based access control. And this is critical in a lot of organizations, because when you're merging, you've got resources in the acquired company that are going to need to be able to play with the important stuff soon, because you promised, or actually the C-suite promised that you would deliver immediate integration of these two, because that was the business model for the upside of this merger. So with Radiant Logic, we can pull this information in from existing systems, from your acquired companies, from whatever sources, and you don't have to do it all at once. You can do this in phases. As you add new sources of information, you can take care of some on-premise data first, and then in phase 2, you can go after all your cloud endpoints and start pulling that data in and adding it into the profile. It just gives you more information, more attributes to make your policies with, to make your policies more granular. And as Jerry will point out, that the policy authoring process for Axiomatics is an ongoing process. It is something that evolves, that as you gather more information, as you get more granularity, you're able to build more granular policies. So what we're going to do here when we take this information in the back end is we're going to normalize this data in Radiant Logic. I'm not changing the sources. I'm not breaking anything. But when you see the same user inside Radiant, all the departments now have a simple assigned name that everyone agrees is going to be the name for department. So sales, regardless of how it was set up in the backend system, is going to show up as sales. And titles are going to be VP of sales if you happen to be the VP of sales, instead of sales, VP or vice pres sales. What I'm doing here is I'm making the data normalized. So when I build a policy, any policy I build that says VP of sales will affect all 3 of these particular identities that have the variations that I've mapped to that core value. And now I make this information available to the policy authoring point, because when you're authorizing or you're authoring a policy, when you're writing a policy, you need to be able to understand what attributes do I have to select from and what values do I have in those attributes. So if I make a policy that says everyone in sales gets access to this resource, and in my system, and I don't identify my sales department as sales, I do it as business development, then no one is going to get access to that resource because no one has that value in their attribute set. So I want to make sure when I'm authoring, I'm looking at the labels for those attributes, and I'm looking at the values to make sure that that information is going to be valid when I build that policy. And again, this is an iterative process. I go through with my business managers, I describe the way someone works, how do they do their job, how do they gain access, what are they doing, and then I build the policy around that and then test that policy and refine it. And then once I've built that and authored that policy, I've taken that user profile in Radiant Logic and I've built a complete profile for the user, and I have normalized all that information. So in the policy information point in Radiant Logic, that user shows up with the title of VP of Sales. Now I put it as end title, so you can just distinguish that as that's different than the source title itself. And you may call the attribute in Axiomatics end title, so you know that it's the normalized version that you're actually pulling at this point and not getting any other data, because the global policy or global profile for that user still may have title in it, and it may be a multi-value field fed by multiple sources. So I have complete control over the naming convention also. So now I have used this normalized view to actually author the policy. And now my policy decision point is going to read through that policy, is going to look to see if this particular user has the attribute values that match the labels that are used in the policy authoring and the values for the filter set in the policy authoring. And this works because this is the same data set. I'm building and comparing from the same data set, and that's critical. You can't build from one data set and compare to another. You won't have matching information for the results you want. So now I get an authorization where this user can get access to particular resources in the sales organization at the VP level because I've verified that information for that particular user. And the reason we're able to do this is Radiant Logic is platform agnostic, schema agnostic, and standards based. So we will talk to any platform that uses a standard protocol to communicate. LDAP for AD and LDAP, JDBC for databases, web services, REST, SCIM, however that platform plays nicely with the rest of the world. And if it's a flat file and it's just dumping out data, we can handle that also. However that provides that information, we can then take that data, and in this scenario, you're looking at a Sun1 LDAP or OID, OUD directory, and LDAP INET org person user schema. And you're looking down below at a SQL database or a feed from an API, basically arbitrary field names selected by the person who built the system or configured the SQL table and populated with data relative to what they thought a contact name was. So you've got completely different formats, structures, schemas, labels in these systems, but because we're agnostic, we are more than happy to merge Andrew Fuller together from both sources, and on the right there, give you a complete profile populated by data from both sources. So it's not a scenario where I'm having to extend the schema in my Active Directory and trying to add in a bunch of extra attributes. I've already filled up all my extended attributes. I've used car license for something else, and now I'm making a bigger mess of my system. And a year and a half from now, someone's going to come back and say, hey, we're retiring this application that you extended the schema for, but we need this new application, needs a whole bunch of new things because it names them differently. Can you go ahead and do that whole process again? Your Active Directory will really become, it'll start to look like my garage. So you don't want to do that to the poor thing. It's not what it's designed for. Let Radiant Logic be the place where all this complexity is sorted out, where it doesn't hurt us to extend schema, where it doesn't matter if I've got attributes that don't fit a particular profile, and I'm not affecting performance, because again, we can scale at levels that are far exceed the scope of what our customers require. Now, there's some key functions here. The linking together of profiles, you want to be able to understand that a person exists in multiple systems. You want to be able to link them together in those systems. They may have different identifiers. As you can see, Nancy Devolio has a certain identifier in system A and a different identifier, Nancy D, in system B, Nancy 456 in system C. So I can use the tools in Radiant Logic to correlate Nancy together using common identifiers and unique attributes and build a profile for Nancy underscore Devolio that has all three of her sources linked together and can bring together the information that I want. Now, I may have a scenario where she has 3 different titles in those 3 different systems. I can decide on an attribute by attribute basis which system is the source of truth for that attribute. So if I've got an HR system that's always the source of truth for title, because that's where our titles get changed, then regardless of how the title appears in other platforms, from old titles she has or things that people typed in or whatever it might be, I'm always going to show you the HR value when you ask me for title. Or at the same time, I may have department is decided by an assignment in Active Directory. So I'm going to use my Active Directory source as the source of truth for department. And I can do this again on an attribute by attribute basis. Each one can have a different source of truth if you care. And I can have multi-valued attributes. I could say, look, these are all the titles that Nancy has, because you may want to clean up her titles. You may want to say, this is the source of truth. Push this out to all those endpoints and normalize this data on all the back ends. So you have a lot of choices on how you manage that information. Now, again, when you're correlating attributes together, when you're joining profiles, you're bringing in information from platforms that have different schemas, different structures, and different protocols. I may be bringing in information over a JDBC driver from a database. I may be bringing in LDAP information from Active Directory, and I may be bringing in something over a web service call or an API call off of Workday. That data is not in a format that just you can throw in a bowl, shake it up, and get uniformity. I need to be able to transform and translate that information into a common set of information in a common view and display that information. Now, ideally, Axiomatics likes to see this as LDAP, and that is very good to source identity data from because LDAP is fast, it retains relationship, it has a lot of performance capabilities for delivering that data. We can also fully text index the full data store of all attributes. So you have some tremendous abilities here to do really fast searches across very complex data sets. But you also may have another application that needs to see this data in another format. Say they want to see it in REST. REST is enabled out of the box in Radiant Logic. So you can have REST as another, all you basically do is connect on a different port and you get back a REST response. You get back JSON as a result from a query instead of an LDAP response. So you can build this information once, you can correlate this data, do the heavy lifting in Radiant Logic where the tools are built for this with a mouse, and then provide that information in multiple different formats and structures and schemas that each application needs to consume. So this is perfect for feeding Axiomatics. That's not the only use case for it though. You may have an IGA project going on where you're trying to put together governance for your provisioning side and segregation of duties and your role-based access reviews and all those functions in your governance tool. And your governance tool is looking at the same mess that you were looking at earlier when you started attribute-based access control, saying, oh my God, I've got to hand code all this scripting to sort out this back end and correlate users and make all this information make sense and normalize data. Why? You've already done it with Radiant Logic. Just point to Radiant, feed that information into your IGA solution, and now your access management platform and your governance platform are both feeding off the same data set. They're both feeding off correlated, clean, normalized data. Their effort goes down dramatically. In fact, Gartner claims that if you do data analytics ahead of your IGA solution, if you use the tools like Radiant to analyze and then clean up your data before you feed it in your IGA solution, you will double your ROI on that project. So imagine your ROI project got done for half the budget, and you actually got twice as far as you would have gotten without Radiant. What's the value and the benefit of bringing that in? So it's a reusable process. And we've been at this again for 20 years. We have customers that have been with us for 15, 18 years that are still using the product. The reason they're using it has evolved because the market and the challenges have evolved, but we're so flexible and so powerful, we're able to provide value over decades to our customers. And that's really rare in this space. Usually there's very few products other than say Active Directory that's been around that long, that's been delivering that kind of consistency, that hasn't been replaced by something else in somebody's life cycle. So what we're trying to solve here is an attribute-based access control challenge, because authorizing users at the highest level, the most granular level, the closest to that zero trust continuous authorization risk-based analysis model is getting into the attribute-based level of authorization. Radiant Logic feeds that for you. But you also have applications that, as Jerry mentioned earlier, may not be as critical. They may not be mission critical. They may be just regular old apps that use groups to authorize access. And with Radiant Logic, you can do a tremendous amount to aggregate groups from multiple sources, especially in a merger and acquisition. We can unnest groups. So if you're going to an IGA evaluation and you've got nested groups deeper than 2, you're going to find out that doesn't work. So you need Radiant to unnest those groups for you. We can build dynamic groups that let you do group authorization based on attribute values is sort of a little brother to ABAC. And then we can also leverage the customization of group integration, static groups, dynamic groups, large queries into single sign-on applications and let you provide additional layers of authorization to other platforms that potentially need that type of information. So again, it's not a point solution. It is optimized for Axiomatics. We work really well together. We solve a lot of challenges together, but the work you're putting into Radiant Logic is so reusable. We've been described as a Swiss Army knife in the sense that we can model information and deliver it for so many different purposes. You may need a wine bottle opener at one time, you may need a toothpick at another. It's all there in the system, and that's all available to you. So one of the things we can do around groups also is the ability to take information from multiple sources, that data set, correlate that into a complete view, and then build filters around that view, much like the policies that Jerry is talking about. Nowhere near as sophisticated. It's not on the level of attribute-based access control, but it gives you the ability to start to model some of this functionality in groups. Use the groups for authorization. And then as you roll out your access control, your attribute-based access control deeper and deeper into the organization, you already have worked out the policies. You've already run them through in the production environment and gotten the result you were looking for. So now you can model those in the Axiomatics platform and extend the system much more easily. Because again, one of the challenges is always understanding the business model and translating that into technology. And contextuality is important in this scenario, as I mentioned before a couple of times. You want to make sure that you understand relationships, because a lot of this is based on ownership or direct reporting or reporting to or member of, or is associated with something that then is part of that decision process. So those associations are as critical as the attributes themselves. And Radiant Logic has got tools built in that lets you take information from multiple systems, multiple objects where I have data with attributes in those objects and relationships between that information, and build that into a hierarchy that can then be used by Axiomatics to build that complete system for that user. So if I'm saying that Nancy can edit any orders that were done by Great Outdoors because she owns a Great Outdoors account, then I can have a simple tree in Radiant Logic that shows you the accounts that she owns, the orders for those accounts, and then the content of those orders. So the Axiomatics can go one place and quickly determine, is order 21, does it belong to Great Outdoors? Does Great Outdoors belong to Nancy? Yes and yes, great, Nancy can edit order 21. So I can build these relationships that feed into that much more granular business type model. Because as you start talking to people in the business side of the house, you'll start getting very kind of convoluted wrapping conversations of relationship, because everything for them is relationship. This belongs to this, this is associated with that, she can do this because she knows this person, she has this relationship. Relationship is what is sitting underneath authorization, it's sitting underneath access control. So that's important that we include that information in that system, and we can model that across multiple different systems in our context builder, which again, this is all mouse driven. This is not writing code. I don't write code. I don't know how. Not since I punched Fortran cards in college, but I can configure this solution to build a detailed hierarchical model, map and rename attributes, manage all this information within Radiant Logic, and provide the ABAC policies that are needed. Now, the Federated Identity Service that we've been talking about today is part of a three-piece orchestra. I guess three pieces isn't an orchestra, it's not even a quartet, but it's three pieces that work together at Radiant Logic. Our ICS, our Identity Correlation and Synchronization tool, allows us to push information out to endpoints. It allows us to provision updates and make changes on endpoints. Because you've pulled all this information together, you've built this golden image, you may want to leverage that now to update information in other systems. You may want to monitor your HR platform when someone's added to HR. You want ICS to kick off a number of workflows that will first day one provision user access into those systems based on policies inside ICS. And CFS adds, in addition to LDAP, REST, XML, and SQL as interfaces for accessing Radiant, it adds SAML, WSFed, OpenID Connect, and OAuth, the federation protocols that are used to give access to SaaS applications, to claims-based applications, more and more now to internal applications that have been federated to make access so much easier and to decouple the identity store from the application itself. So it's a complete family solution there. We're coming up on the top of the hour. I'm going to get through the summary here, and then we'll open it up for some questions. Basically, what we're doing here with Axiomatics and Radiant Logic is we're reducing development and maintenance costs for applications. You're externalizing authorization, you're normalizing the information, you're correlating that data and making it available at the speed of a directory, you're simplifying the policy authoring point, you're building policies that are business-centric, that deliver access control, that models the way the business works. And you're doing all that in a way that you're not writing code. You're not sitting there with developers in cubicles for 6 months trying to duplicate what was promised in the PowerPoint presentation that'll only work in that one scenario as long as nothing changes. You've got a flexible, powerful tool here that you can evolve and expand and enhance as you go along and expand the footprint within your organization as more and more successes are realized. This improves security on the application layer. The more granular your controls, the more you can lock down an application, the more you can block a bad operator. Someone who compromises someone's access is going to be narrowly defined to what they can do based on what that user had access to. You're not talking about keys to the kingdom scenarios here. You're talking about very granular authorization of access to systems, what people can do based on their roles. And now, as the people get a higher level of access based on the policies, you can monitor those people much more closely. They become privileged accounts are not just admin accounts in AD. Privileged accounts are not just root user accounts in Unix. There are also people that have a high level of access in the Axiomatics platform. They have read and write on critical platforms. They've been given this access because of their job. Those now are privileged accounts, and those need to be monitored and managed in the same way that you're doing other high-value accounts. So it gives you a capability of authorizing granularly and then enhancing that process. Again, speed to market is critical. This is going to make things so much faster, so much easier, so much more flexible. One of our customers cut their application integration cost by 73% by reducing the complexity and the challenges of integrating new applications. And basically they said they're doing in days, which used to take them months or never. And it was a game changer in their organization. That's a major chip manufacturer that we've had as a customer for quite a long time. Implementing new compliance rules, again, with the California compliance rules that have just come out, with GDRP, with all those scenarios, you have to be able to tell people who has access to what and why. Policies are a map to that. It's like reading English. Oh, I can see as an auditor, this is the control that's used to give access to this resource. These are the people that meet that particular filter. These people have that access, and this is why. Makes perfect sense. Check mark, you're on your way. It's just intuitive to use this type of process when you're looking at that kind of access control. And especially if you're talking about customers and personal information, you can start to get very granular in the control of personal information. Who can see it, who can manage it, who can show it, who can share it. That becomes more and more critical because you have to be able to prove that now and make those proofs available to the end customer themselves. And then the one that I love is future-proofing your infrastructure with a standards-based solution. These are both standards-based solutions. We're built for integrating with the rest of the world. We're not a unique one-off scenario where everyone else has to bend to our will. We play well with everybody else. So all the sources of identity information, all the application integration layers, all that is things we're built to integrate with, we're built to operate on. So integration, again, is going to be much simpler, much easier for us to operate with. So I am going to open it up now to questions, and unfortunately, I think if I expand this, I'm not sure that it actually shows you the questions or not, but I'm going to go ahead and take a swing here that you can't see this box in the middle. And Jerry, you still there?
Hey, Wade, I'm still here.
All right. Hey, look at that. I got to the top of the hour without a question asked yet. You were right. One of the questions that came in was, what are the performance benefits of such a combination of Radiant and Axiomatics? And I'll let you touch on the performance side, Jerry, to start with, because I think the end user experience is really where this is seen as a benefit.
Yeah, that's right, Wade, because we're operating at runtime, so any latency in that process of evaluating the access is going to impact the response time back to that particular user. So the fact, as you described, that Radiant can aggregate all of the data we need to evaluate a policy in one single feed, it makes our system that much faster, because sometimes one of these back-end systems may be, let's just say, not runtime enabled. You know, it's not used to being used at runtime and have that kind of responsiveness. This is where Radiant can step in and basically be a cache of all this data that's at the ready for us to use at runtime.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point I don't think I made during the presentation. If you looked at our graphic, there's a blue sphere. It's the logic engine that provides all the wonders that I described. And then inside that is a golden pyramid. That golden pyramid is our HDAP store. It's our own storage platform based on Hadoop, Zookeeper, and Lucene. And it's optimized for full text indexing because we use Lucene as a bottom-up index. And it's optimized for performance to deliver that information at the speed of a directory in very, very large data sets. And that's key. We can take these complex processes of correlating all this information, and then we store the result on disk in that golden pyramid, but we monitor those backends in real time for changes. So if there's real-time change detections, like in AD, we will notice that somebody changed departments in Active Directory. We'll immediately update that information in all the places inside their stored profiles that information has an effect. We'll update the department, we'll update the normalized value for department, we'll update the groups that may be driven by department. So the information is going to be real-time accurate to the back end, but all that lifting and correlation work, you don't want to do that at runtime on our end because it takes too long to process. So we do that, pre-process that, and store that information ahead of time. So the combination of the two is really everything's at your fingertips at runtime. There is no wait, there is no latency, and it provides an amazing user experience. Let's touch on a couple other questions here. We'll go a little bit over. It sounds like you do group management as well. Did I hear that correctly? Or was it just the decoupling of groups and nested groups? Well, group management is kind of a nebulous term in terms of all the different things you can think about in terms of managing groups. We don't have a group lifecycle management function where someone can request a group and someone then authorizes them to make that group, and the group has a time bomb life on it, or it goes through a review like you might in an IGA solution where you're building policies. But we can manage groups. We can build groups, again, based on attribute values, so that everybody that's in Chicago in sales that works on large accounts is in a particular group. If I move to New York, I'm taken out of that group automatically. I'm added to the appropriate New York groups. If everyone stops doing large account management in Chicago, that group will disappear. So I can automate the management of that group and the population of that group. So you don't have to manually add, remove users from groups because you built a filtered policy for that. Now I can add owners to that and descriptions. And we have tools for a lot of group discovery and group analysis. So you can see all your groups and the information that's in them, if there's owners, if there's descriptions, and if there's even users. There's a lot of empty groups out there sometimes. So you can do a lot with groups within Radiant Logic, both on the data analysis tool and then on merging them together, remapping groups, remapping CNs and DNs for merged group trees, and however you want to manage that information. But we can definitely get a deeper answer for you on that. Does the system collect attributes regarding which endpoint the end user is using, the location of the machine, current risk level? And Jerry, I think you talked about some environmental pieces there, if you want to touch on that.
Well, things like risk level, that can be determined by some kind of risk engine, whether it's from the authentication process, what did I use? Was it a password or is it a multi-factor authentication? There can be some risk score associated with that. Similarly, there could be a general risk tolerance for the business application itself, as far as approval levels or similar. So any of that data can also be an input to the access control decision and could in fact be sourced from Radiant Logic.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yeah, that's again risk level. If you've got a risk engine, the nice thing about Radiant is it'll talk to anybody that will share information, and we can then give the application like Axiomatics a single place to go to get everything, including the user attributes and their current risk score. And because we're listening on the back end in real time, we're going to be able to update that risk score as it changes and provide the attributes that are appropriate or the values that are appropriate in the time or the moment that authorization is being made. And that kind of leads into the next one here is, do you allow policy enforcement not just based on static attributes, but also based on dynamic attributes? My interpretation of dynamic attribute is an attribute that may change frequently, and it may be something that is, say, the IP address that you logged in with, or it may be, I'm trying to think of what other things that happen really dynamically in the identity space. But from a Radiant standpoint, any attribute that we are presenting to Axiomatics, if it's coming from a source and that source is updating that attribute, and it may be last logon. So, the person just logged in, that's great. We record that time. The person logs in again, we record that time. We're going to feed Axiomatics the most current data we have from the sources that we're getting it from. So if it's something that's dynamic in the sense that attribute is being updated regularly or changing, that most current value is what we're going to deliver to Axiomatics. And Jerry, on your side, is the concept of dynamic attributes something that you're familiar with?
Yes, yes.
Kill me this business.
Right, and there's a spectrum of how dynamic an attribute is. Your date of birth usually is pretty static, but things like that risk score that we just talked about for your authentication session, well, that changes every time you authenticate. And things like your department, that can change, but maybe not as frequently. So in our policies, these attributes are represented by variables, so they will be dynamically retrieved at runtime, and then the volatility of the particular attribute itself is just the nature of that that data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that the fact that we're both doing things at runtime, this is not a static set of data that's getting stale the minute it's collected. This is data that's dynamically current to the environment as close as we can get, depending on how well the environment cooperates. If the system doesn't provide change detection, we have a harder time picking it up, but we can do it incrementally. Okay, we're about 8 minutes after the hour. I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. I do appreciate everyone joining us today, and there's a number of other questions here.